The retirees who spend the most are not always the ones with the biggest portfolios. They're often the ones who stopped automatically buying the things that their parents bought. Today, I want to show you 7 purchases that wealthy younger boomers and older Gen Xers are reconsidering, where that money is going instead, and how you might make the same trade in retirement. If you're new to the channel, my name is Benjamin Brandt. I've been a retirement planner for what feels like a billion years, and I want to help you have an even better retirement. Now, the first thing that's disappearing is the reason that we couldn't play ball in the house as kids, and that's the good china. So for decades, couples registered for 12-place settings, serving platters, teacups, crystal, silver, all that stuff, because they believed that they were assembling something very valuable that would eventually be passed down to their children. But now generations of those dishes are now reaching the resale market all at once. In fact, estate sale professionals say that china and crystal are among the hardest things in the house to sell. Some consignment stores won't even take them, and now complete sets that once cost thousands of dollars can now be found online for less than $50. The problem is that the generation that valued them is downsizing or dying, and dead people don't buy dishes. And the generation inheriting them does not have the space or the lifestyle or the desire to store 80 fragile dishes for a dinner party that might not ever happen. But this doesn't mean that Gen X or today's retirees have stopped buying physical things. They're just simply buying different things. And when they do spend money on physical things, those purchases increasingly have an experiential quality to them. Vinyl records would be a perfect example. According to the Recording Industry Association of America, the RIAA, U.S. vinyl revenue increased 9.3% in 2025, marking the 19th consecutive year for growth. Revenue from vinyl records also surpassed $1 billion for the first time in 2025, with nearly 47 million album sales. People are still wanting to buy and collect and display physical objects, but they increasingly want objects that connect them to an experience or a memory or a version of themselves that they want to revisit. This is where I see an important generational shift starting to happen. Many baby boomers retired forward. They bought the fine china because they imagined a future filled with formal dinners and holidays and family gatherings. That purchase was an aspirational purchase. But younger boomers and Gen X retirees often seem to retire backwards. They buy that Creedence Clearwater Revival record because it takes them back to high school or back to their first car, or back to a period of life that still feels vivid and meaningful. Their spending is often less about building a new identity in retirement and more about recovering parts of an old identity. Older baby boomer retirements were frequently organized around what they hoped life might become, whereas I see Gen X retirement is increasingly organized around returning to what they already know that they loved. The number 2 trade that a lot of wealthier Gen X are making is that this emerging generation of retirees is drinking less, a lot less. Gallup has tracked American drinking habits since 1939, and in 2025, just 54% of American adults said that they drank alcohol, which is the lowest percentage that Gallup has ever recorded. And that's down from 62% in 2023 and 58% in 2024, marking 3 consecutive years of pretty significant decline. Younger adults started pulling away from alcohol many years ago, but the change has now reached retirement age. The Wine Market Council found that boomers had the largest recent decline in wine drinking, falling from 32% of wine customers in 2023 to 26% in 2025, while Gen X held steady at 26%. Some of this does appear to be health-related. People are looking at that nightly glass of wine, especially those that are tracking our sleep and recovery, and deciding it might not be doing us any favors. Number 3 is a really big one, and it's parked in a lot of driveways, and that is the RV. RV manufacturers shipped a record of 600,000 units in 2021, which was the height of the pandemic buying boom. Then shipments fell really hard, down almost 18% in 2022 and another 36% in 2023. By the end of that 2-year decline, annual shipments have been cut nearly in half. The industry did recover some in 2024, but even then, it shipped only a little over 300,000 RVs, way below the pandemic peak. Now, a lot of that decline was caused by higher interest rates, so those numbers alone don't prove that retirees have suddenly stopped buying RVs. But the RV still illustrates an important question for this emerging generation of retirees. Do you need to own the thing to enjoy the experience? The RV was always sold as a dream, right? The open road, seeing the country on your own schedule, visiting every state that's not Hawaii. Plenty of retirees bought into that dream, only to discover that ownership also came with a bunch of stuff like storage and insurance and maintenance and repairs and just everything else. In fact, the latest industry research says the median RV is used about 30 days per year. Now, that is meaningful use, but it also means that your average owner is storing and maintaining an RV for about 335 days when it's not even out on the road. So for a retiree who might take 1 or 2 big trips a year, potentially renting an RV could deliver much of the same experience while allowing someone else to own that depreciation and storage costs and insurance and repair when it's sitting in the driveway for the rest of the year. Right? They still want the open road, these retirees, but they're asking whether or not the open road needs to occupy 40 feet of their driveway, all year long, which leads to item number 4, the vacation home. Now, this is probably my least favorite item on this list because I love to see retirees, especially retirees from the Midwest or the Northeast, leave that snowblower behind and spend part of the winter someplace warm. I'm not arguing against that type of lifestyle at all. The question is whether enjoying a second location in retirement requires owning a second property. Demand for financed second homes has fallen sharply from its pandemic peak. According to Redfin, second home mortgages represented just 2.6% of all purchase mortgages in 2024, the lowest share in its records, and down from about 5% in 2020. Some of this decline is clearly just part of the economic situation we're in. Mortgage rates are higher, home prices are higher, and the pandemic created this second home buying frenzy that was just never going to last forever. But it also creates an important retirement planning conversation. How many months realistically are you going to use this property? Will your family members visit you as much as you hope? Will you want to return to the same place every single year? Or are you going to want to try Arizona for one winter and Tennessee for the next winter, and then maybe be closer to the kids in Georgia or North Carolina the year after that? For somebody that spends maybe 4 or 5 months or more per year in the same community, sure, ownership might make perfect sense. But if the property is going to be used for only a few weeks a year, I think renting might deliver nearly all the same experience without all the stuff that we don't like that comes with it, like maintenance and insurance and taxes and repairs and everything else that comes with the responsibility of owning a second home in retirement. This is not about giving up the dream of escaping winter. It's about separating the experience from the ownership. We might still want warm weather or the beach or mountain hikes or time with family. The question is whether or not we need to own the property to have that experience. By the way, if you love retirement planning ideas like these, you should join my free newsletter. It's called This Week in Retirement, where every Thursday I send you the best retirement planning articles and podcasts and YouTube videos that I found that week. The link is in the description. Number 5 is a bit heavier, but it honestly is one of the clearest changes in how Americans are spending money, and that's the fancy funeral. So for many generations, we had to have the casket and the cemetery plot and the headstone and the viewing and just the full funeral service. That was basically treated as an essential automatic purchase. It's simply what families did. But the numbers have flipped pretty radically. According to the National Funeral Directors Association, cremation was projected to account for about 63% of deaths in 2025, compared with just 31% for burial. Cremation is now roughly twice as common, and the association projects that it could account for more than 82% of dispositions by 2045. That doesn't mean that people no longer want to remember or honor the people that they love. Many families still want to have meaningful funerals or celebrations of life or memorial services, but what is changing is the assumption that remembrance requires all the expensive stuff. The national median price for a funeral with viewing and burial is about $8,300, compared to roughly $6,300 for funeral with a viewing and a cremation. That's a real difference of about $2,000 before cemetery expenses are even considered. Younger boomers and older Gen Xers see these decisions differently than their parents did. They seem to prefer something more simple or more flexible or maybe just more personal. It's just one more major expense that used to feel automatic but increasingly doesn't anymore. Now, speaking of death, number 6 is insurance that you may no longer need, starting with life insurance. Now, think about why you bought your life insurance in the first place. You maybe had a mortgage, maybe you had kids at home, you had limited savings, we had not filled out our retirement accounts yet, and maybe one income was carrying the household. Well, if something happened to you, your family could have financially fallen off a cliff. So you bought a policy to protect them. And for 20 or 30 years, that policy really bridged the gap while you paid down your debt and raised the kids and built up your retirement portfolio. But look at your life now. Your mortgage might be gone or largely gone. Your kids might be grown, largely independent. And your assets might now be large enough to do the job that insurance was originally there to do. Your policy did exactly what it was supposed to do for the time that you had it. It fulfilled its assignment, but now maybe you don't need it anymore. Now, that doesn't mean everybody should run out and cancel their life insurance. Before you change anything, you really need to model what happens to your surviving spouse. What are my survivor options for my pension or my Social Security? What about debt? What about estate planning needs? But the larger principle here is really worth understanding. Insurance is just renting someone else's balance sheet. When you were younger, you needed the insurance company's balance sheet, but now you have a balance sheet of your own. The same idea applies with the insurance that we plan on keeping. A lot of financially independent retirees might still carry the $250 or $500 home or auto deductible that they picked decades ago when they had far less money. Back then, $250 might have been real money that you didn't have just sitting around, compared to today when you could potentially absorb a $1,000 or a $2,500 expense for a deductible, and it wouldn't have any meaningful impact on your overall net worth. By taking on a little bit more of these small risks yourself, you're probably able to lower the premium that you pay every month. And then, of course, that leads us directly into long-term care insurance, the big decision. Younger boomers and older Gen Xers are now aging into this choice, And many affluent households are looking beyond just buying the traditional long-term care insurance policy. Part of that hesitation comes from watching what happened to their parents. Some families paid in premiums for decades and they never used the coverage and they never received anything in return. Others were hit with large premium increases at an age where you really can't replace the policy, and finding more money to pay for bigger premiums is pretty hard to do. The insurers themselves are also part of this miscalculation. These policies really struggled because people kept them longer than expected and used more benefits than the companies had priced into the policies, which means that carriers left the market, which narrowed everybody's choices, and premiums rose pretty sharply. So for a wealthy household, that raises another possibility that more people are evaluating, which is self-insurance. Suppose, for example, long-term care costs $10,000 per month in your area and it lasts about 3 years. We'll call that $360,000. Now, if you're part of a household with a few $1,000,000 of investments or potentially substantial home equity, could you maybe carry some of that risk instead of paying premiums indefinitely? Your home and your home equity is increasingly part of this self-insurance plan. If we need care, that home equity could help pay for it. If care is never needed, well, that house just stays part of your estate. That does not make self-insuring right for everybody. A major care expense cannot be allowed to financially damage your healthy spouse, but for a household with enough assets, it might be reasonable to ask whether or not our own balance sheet can now do the job that the insurance company used to do. Again, that's part of financial independence. I don't want to blanket recommend anything for anybody. These strategies aren't appropriate for everybody, but I think it further reflects a larger shift that this generation is reconsidering insurance that once felt almost automatic for the generation in front of us, and now we're asking whether or not our own assets can now better carry this risk. But here's what surprised me the most when I was researching this list. Based on the conversations that I have every day with retirees, I expected some of the classic retirement activities to be fading along with the fine china and the RV and the fancy funeral. I thought that cruises would be down quite a bit. I thought that timeshares would also be down quite a bit, and I expected golf to be significantly down, but I could not have been more wrong. The cruise industry just had a record year, and roughly 1/3 of its passengers are now under the age of 40. The timeshare industry reports that the average owner has gotten younger, falling from age 53 to 47, with millennials and Gen Z now making up a majority of new buyers, and golf participation has grown for the 8th consecutive year in a row. The classic retiree activities did not disappear like I thought they might, but younger generations have adopted them, sometimes even before traditional retirement age. But new retirees did not always adopt them in exactly the same form, and this was anticipated, I guess. Cruise ships have been redesigned for younger travelers with more opportunities for entertainment and flexible dining and fitness and just more experiences. Timeshares, which I generally don't recommend, have shifted away from owning the same week in the same place and now is more of a point system that can be used across different destinations. Even the timeshare industry had to move from fixed ownership more towards the direction of flexible access. And that's the pattern that's underneath this entire idea. New retirees, which are younger boomers and older Gen Xers, they haven't stopped spending entirely, but what they are doing is reconsidering the purchases that used to feel automatic. And what they're doing is they're keeping the parts that provide personal meaning and flexibility and real experience rather than just stuff. They might not want the fancy china, but they will buy the vinyl records. They might not want the fancy funeral, but they still want the inexpensive memorial service and cremation. They might not want the second home, but they still want to escape the winters. This generation is not spending less simply for the sake of spending less. It's just becoming much more deliberate about what this money is for. It's moving away from obligation and permanence and towards the people and memories and experiences that it already knows that it values. Thanks for watching.